Thanks everyone for coming out. This is our final speaker for this semester, and we're very happy to have with us Dr. Johann Klaassen. Dr. Klaassen has degrees from St. John's College in Santa Fe, also Washington University in St. Louis. He's now Vice President at First Affirmative Financial Network. And his talk today is War, Financial Collusion, and Economic Citizenship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Klaassen.
You left the good part of the title of Blood and Money. That's where this talk started. Is talking with my good friend Jeremy Kiemer, who unfortunately couldn't be here. He's rather far away. The American University of Sharjah is in the United Arab Emirates, Dubai. So he's not able to be here. Just a little bit more, I sort of have to start off by saying a little bit about who I am, how I am where I am. First Affirmative Financial Network is the largest and not the only, but definitely the largest and the longest established registered investment advisory firm that specializes all and only in socially responsible or sustainable investment. We've been doing what we do since 1988, I guess, which isn't all that long, but considering. I've been with First Affirmative since 1990, since 2000. I was going to say 99. I did my graduate work, as Rob said, I did my undergraduate at St. John's College, but at my graduate work at Washington University in St. Louis, where I worked with Larry Tang and Marilyn Friedman. And after bopping around academia for a couple of years in one-year teaching positions, sabbatical replacements, that sort of thing, my family and I decided that we were done doing that, and we came back to Colorado where my life grew up. So I talked my way into this job at First Affirmative. Didn't take a lot of talking, actually, just because the match was so good. They didn't have anybody who had specialized in ethics on staff ever before, and now they do. Let's see. Trying to think if I need to say anything more about that. Candace was asking a little while ago what you do in a full-time daytime job, where you go at 8 o'clock and leave at 5 o'clock. I spend most of my time writing investment policy statements for clients, helping them to sort out, on one hand, what their financial goals are, what their risk tolerance levels are, that sort of thing. And on the other hand, what their ethical interests are, what the most important things are for them to support or not support, as the case may be. And then we construct portfolios on the basis of those so we really help bring the financial lives and the moral lives of our clients together. I suppose I could have done some sort of fancy PowerPoint, slideshow or something like that, but I didn't really have the time. This paper doesn't really lend itself to that kind of presentation, so I don't know how to look at those anyway. That's amazing. I remember going to a conference, a philosophy conference, in 1996, 97, where somebody from business school was there to talk about business ethics. And he had a PowerPoint presentation, and nobody in the room knew what to do. Did they look at the screen? Do they look at how does this work? It just blew everybody's mind. But it's just part of what I do now, is to make these kind of presentations, those kind of presentations. So this is going back a step further. Let me just go ahead and start on this, and stop me if something needs clarification. In the 1980s, philosophers and other academics spent considerable time and energy thinking about apartheid, the governmental policy of racial separation then in place in South Africa. Many felt that it was vital for their universities to undertake divestment in their endowment funds. They argued that university endowments should not participate in the profits derived from this manifest injustice, and so should sell off the securities issued by corporations doing significant business in South Africa. Understanding that divestment meant selling those securities to someone else who had no qualms about supporting South Africa's apartheid policies, and so that for the university to refuse to profit from this injustice meant simply that someone else would. It nonetheless seemed absolutely vital to suggest divestment to the trustees who controlled the university endowments. Why? Perhaps, as Anthony Appia has suggested, it has to do with feelings of taint, the sense that even though we aren't directly responsible for some moral evil, if we are benefiting from some evil, that connects us to it. If we contribute, even unwittingly, to something that we believe to be radically evil, shouldn't we feel bad in some way? If we benefit directly from something that's profoundly unjust, shouldn't we feel dirty? There are those among us who believe that most modern wars are unjust and should not be fought. There are some who hold that no war has ever been just, because war is inherently unjustifiable. In the United States, conscientious objectors have been exempted from military service through most of the 20th century out of respect for their religious or philosophical convictions about the immorality of war. I'm actually named for one of those. My grandfather's oldest brother, Johann Klaassen, died in Leavenworth Prison of the flu during World War I. Egregious personal detail. Generally, conscientious objectors are offered alternative service and trained to perform some other service vital to the smooth operation of the American military. Some, like my great uncle, even refuse alternative service because to contribute in this way amounts to a kind of support for war. Similarly, some pacifists today refuse to pay federal taxes because a large portion of every tax dollar is used to support the American military. Some refuse to pay only that percentage used for military funding, while others refuse to pay federal taxes at all. Military service is, of course, a direct way to support war. Paying taxes is less direct, but can still be seen as contrary to the pacifists' presumed principles. Many people don't know that they may be supporting the war by way of their investment dollars. The U.S. military is supported by tax dollars, to be sure, but also by the federal debt, especially in this era of deficit spending, and those investors who purchase U.S. Treasury securities, either directly or through mutual funds, are thereby indirectly supporting the U.S. military, voting for military funding with their loudest vote, their dollars. The odds are good that these same investors are not only funding the military but profiting from it as well. Most individual portfolio managers and mutual fund managers have no hesitation to invest in defense contractors, especially since such corporations are among the largest and best respected in the world. Can conscientious objectors and other pacifists maintain their investments in the securities offered by the U.S. Treasury and defense contractors? As political citizens, these objectors protest against war, but as economic citizens, they support it. The notion of economic citizenship is gaining acceptance in human rights circles, and its semantics are still somewhat confusing. As we understand the expression, we, meaning Jeremy and myself, economic citizenship is a way of being a citizen by way of one's economic actions. Just as one can be a citizen by voting, a political action, so one can be a citizen by spending, gifting, or investing one's money in various ways. The most well-known form of economic citizenship is probably boycott. In this paper, we'll argue the particular point that those who embrace generally nonviolent principles ought not to invest their assets in securities which support or profit from military spending. But we'll also argue a more general point that we're responsible for unintended economic contributions to causes that we morally oppose. Through this more general point, we hope to illuminate some features of economic citizenship. Our method of proceeding, well, you'll see, I suppose. To help us, let's consider these three cases, and we see two of them here. First, what if we donate money to a Palestinian charity which uses our funds to purchase bomb-making supplies which are used to construct a suicide bomb which kills 25 Israeli civilians in Tel Aviv? Second case, we buy bonds issued by a military contractor which uses our dollars to purchase bomb-making supplies or to build a factory, which are used to construct a smart bomb which goes stupid and kills 25 civilians in a classic case of collateral damage. Or third, we buy bonds from the U.S. Treasury, which uses our dollars to buy that smart bomb which kills 25 civilians. How responsible, if at all, are we in these cases? Furthermore, what does it mean to participate in some kind of harm short of actually causing the harm ourselves? What sort of responsibility do we bear for benefiting from some harm that we didn't do?
Here's a specific case. This is sort of to backtrack a bit, I guess, and to give a bit of background. The single event that prompted the writing of this paper. The U.S.-led invasion of Iraq was met with widespread skepticism and citizen protest. One peaceful protest faced particularly determined and violent police resistance. Approximately 500 people arrived at the port of Oakland early on April 7th, 2003, so a year and a half ago, to demonstrate against the war in Iraq. The port of Oakland. With no evident provocation, police fired non-lethal projectiles at the protesters and nearby longshoremen in an attempt to disperse the crowd. The longshoremen were there trying to see if they could, waiting for their union rep to decide whether they could cross the picket line or not. These are the non-lethal weapons that actually killed that young woman in Boston recently, so they're not exactly non-lethal. We've got some pictures here too. I should pull this out. These pictures show you what happens when these non-lethal projectiles hit people. Not pretty. There's several pictures too. So. Okay, let me back up. Where did I stop? There we go. Well, the response was, to put it mildly, excessive. Our question concerns a different and surprising aspect of this protest. Why were protesters gathering at the port of Oakland in the first place, rather than, say, at some federal building or military installation? Heaven knows there are plenty of those in the Bay Area. There were other protests on the same day at San Francisco's federal buildings and at the Concord Naval Weapons Station, but these were much smaller. According to AP accounts of the Oakland demonstration and its aftermath, protesters said they targeted the port of Oakland because at least one of the companies there, APL, is handling war supplies. What strikes us as particularly interesting about this protest is that while other activists were demonstrating their disapproval of military action in Iraq at governmental and military sites, these activists chose to protest a shipping company's limited, perhaps even tangential, participation in the military's war efforts. Did these activists draw a connection between APL's profiting from their military contracts and their sense that this war was unjust? In other words, did these protesters feel that the shipping companies based at the port of Oakland were colluding with the U.S. military, and so were at least partially responsible for the harms inevitably done in the war? And yet, how many of these demonstrators were contributing to or profiting directly from the very war that they were protesting against? More than half of Americans now have some sort of investments in the form of tax-deferred retirement accounts, 401k plans, 403b plans, IRAs, or individual taxable investment accounts. Approximately 52% of all American families had some form of stock holdings in 2001, according to Associated Press. Again, it's the first time it passed 50%. It's 2001. The largest mutual fund in the United States is the Vanguard 500 Index Fund. It has approximately $77 billion as of the end of October. It's a very popular choice in retirement accounts because of its exceptionally low management fees and excellent tracking of the S&P 500. And the largest holding of this fund, 3.2%, more than $2.5 billion, General Electric. GE is a huge conglomerate, of course, with a spotty record of environmental abuses and human rights violations in the third world, and one of the largest military contractors in the U.S., the manufacturer of engines for F-16s and the Apache Longbow helicopter, among other things. All of the 10 largest stock funds in the United States hold GE in varying amounts. If a little more than half of these anti-war protesters owned some mutual fund, the odds are quite high that by means of their investments, they unwittingly contributed to or profited from the war that they so strongly opposed. Now, I'm not saying definitely everybody there was profiting from this war, but odds are darn good that a good number of those folks were profiting from this war that they were protesting. Such unintentional collusion creates a tension between two parts of the activists' life. On the one hand, as political citizens, they protest against militarism and war, while on the other hand, as economic citizens, they support militarism and war. We believe that this tension can and should be resolved. Those whose political lives are dedicated to peace ought not to support violence in their financial lives, and this can be quite simply accomplished. The argument runs like this. First, investors who purchase U.S. Treasury securities contribute to the U.S. military's ability to purchase weapons and make war. Second, investors who own stock in or bonds offered by military contractors profit from the production and sale of weapons of war. Third, this is a boring bit. It's not necessary to invest in U.S. Treasury and military contractor securities to create an appropriately diversified portfolio, and comparable portfolios can be constructed without those securities with reasonable ease. Fourth, those who participate in, contribute to, or benefit from some harm they can reasonably avoid bear some responsibility for that harm even if they do not directly produce the harm. Therefore, those investors who do not wish to bear responsibility for the harms inevitably done in war should not invest in those securities, U.S. Treasury or military contractor securities. Now, the first and second of these premises are claims that relatively few people make, but which we think shouldn't be seen as particularly controversial. Given that approximately 51% of the federal government's 2004 budget for discretionary spending was, I should say, given over to military spending of one sort or another. And that's not counted repayment of past debt, which some anti-war accountants really want to count old debt that financed war as part of the current war budget, current military budget. And considering that spending deficits estimated at more than $450 billion for 2004 and even more for 2005, these deficits must be funded with Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. It would be very difficult for the investors who purchase those Treasury obligations to claim that their investment dollars are not going to the U.S. military. No, I'm buying this $10,000 U.S. Treasury bond, but I'm buying it for the investment in Head Start, and not for the 51% that goes over into the military spending. That doesn't make sense to me. Similarly, given the integrated nature of such military contractors as Boeing and Lockheed Martin, it would be very difficult for investors who own the securities of these companies to claim that their investment dollars represent only the peaceful parts of these companies' businesses. That is, investors can't buy shares in 747s that exclude F-15 Eagles, FA-18EF Super Hornets. Investors can't support the federal government's Head Start and Medicare programs, but not Peterson Air Force Base or Guantanamo Bay. The third premise is also unusual, but additionally controversial. Altogether, too many investors and investment professionals remain unaware of the variety and flexibility of investment options open to them under the general heading of socially responsible investing. Most, and SRI is the standard sort of abbreviation for that. Most SRI mutual funds have some kind of negative screens, that is, they screen certain kinds of companies out, ensuring that the securities of companies which they find morally troublesome, such as those that do a large part of their business with the military, are not included in those portfolios. Close examination of the variety and quality of SRI options puts the lie to the unfortunately persistent presumption that for investors to invest according to their values will necessarily lower portfolio performance. Academic securities analysis studies have repeatedly shown that SRI strategies result in performance comparable to conventional portfolios. You don't have to give up profits in order to invest according to your conscience. Given contemporary information technology, it's easy to find out exactly how one's portfolio is invested, and investors can check with their investments for congruence with their personal, social, political, and moral imperatives on their own, or by hiring an investment advisor who specializes in SRI. I happen to be. We feel that the moral cost of supporting injustice would more than outweigh the cost of monitoring one's investments and investment allocations, even if those costs were much greater than they actually are. So far, though, all we've really claimed is that to invest in securities offered by the Treasury and military contractors is to support and profit from militaries, and that financially prudent portfolios can be constructed without those securities with relative ease. The fourth premise, though, draws a connection between participating in, contributing to, or benefiting from a harm and being responsible for it. And as such, it's very controversial and philosophical. Defending this claim is almost the rest of this. To be clear, we freely admit that the financial relation the investors have to the war they consider unjust is neither a cause of that war nor a form of participation in it. Rather, in this section, we're going to argue that investors unintentionally contribute to the war. The question is why we think that they should be responsible for an unintended contribution that they might make. The next section will then show that in the kind of case we have here, the category of negligence. This is really poorly. I didn't look at this paragraph. Category of negligence. Well, I'm going to come back and talk about negligence as the key to understanding responsibility for bad investments of this kind. Let's see. there's some stuff on causation here that I'm just going to skip past. When we act, for what might we reasonably be held responsible? Well, it seems commonplace to ascribe responsibility to a causal agent who does some harm, the one who pulls the trigger. It's certainly less common to ascribe responsibility to someone who happens to indirectly promote a corporate harm several steps removed. Consider this: the military command is the direct locus of responsibility for the harms done in war. The defense contractor merely supplies the military commands with the material for their intentions, and that through the intermediary of the government. An investment portfolio in turn merely supplies an important means for the defense contractor, some investor's money, perhaps mediated by an investment advisor or a mutual fund manager. One can expect to see roughly 4 corporate steps are removed between the direct agent of harm and the original material investment. Why should the investor be held responsible with that kind of separation from harms? To begin with, it's clear the investor is not a cause of war. Okay, I'm just going to skip that stuff. There's a couple pages here about Aristotelian causation that Jeremy thought was necessary. And for the published version of the paper, it might be, but not today. Right, anyway, let's see. It doesn't make prima facie sense to say that an investor causes a war in any standard sense. However, we're not only responsible for what we cause, but also for some things that we merely support. What would it mean to say that an investor supports a war that his investments serve? To answer this question, we need to eliminate the obvious contender for how we might support some spatially and temporally distinct action: corporate agency. We're not talking about corporate agency. A corporate agent is an actor made up of parts that work together for the sake of an overall intention. A corporation, for obvious example. Corporate agents are not individual persons, but organizations. The principle of organization is the corporate intention. Thus, we can explain why a group of people in suits organize the way they do down on Madison and 47th, because they're acting together in the XYZ corporation. And the corporate aim is to make profits. If you stop one of them while they're acting and you say, "Why are you running down the hall with your cell phone like this?" She can say, "I'm doing this in order to meet my partner who's closing a deal, and I'm doing that because I work for XYZ, and we try to earn a profit." The financier's actions are part of the whole intention of the organization. It means to its ends. The financier participates in the corporation. That's how she supports it. Corporate agency shows us that one can support an aim by being in a part-whole relation to it, by being a means to the aim. This is what participation is, in some strict sense. The aim of a war is to do violence sufficient to remove the obstacle of the enemy. What are the means to this kind of aim? Some include guns, bullets, infrared goggles, soldiers, munitions manufacturers, investments in those manufacturers, willing investors. Willing investors in the defense industry might be part of the war effort. They might participate in it and in this way support it. This point isn't quite as easy to make as that, though. The investors we have in mind will probably not respond as parts of the war effort when questioned. You can't stop them, ask them what they're doing, making their investments, and expect them to say, "Oh, I'm making this investment so as to support a defense contractor, so as to support a war in Iraq." Some might say that, but most won't. Investors don't look like corporate agents in the normal sense. That's probably not the way to explain how they support the war. However, they still contribute to the war. Our argument here is going to force us to come up with a way in which we might be responsible for what we did not cause or intend to do. Does it even make sense to do so? Well, obviously, we think so. We're commonly held responsible for unintended harms we could readily avoid. Here's an example. Imagine you're driving your car through a mall parking lot. It's a busy Sunday afternoon, and there are people about, especially children. You're gazing at the tree line on the hill next to the mall, enamored with the way the trees sway in the light and wind. You're not watching the area ahead of your car. Clearly, unintentionally, you hit a 6-year-old girl who's crossing the way. Getting out of the car and bending over bending over the crumpled body, you're grief-stricken. Clearly, you did not intend to hit the little girl. However, you are responsible. You should have read the space ahead of you. Similarly, if you happen to donate to a charity that has listed on its website, "We contribute to martyr brigades," or "We contribute to counter-revolutionary Zionist causes," it would seem that you could readily avoid contributing to a harm that you, of course, also didn't. We propose that investors who support the war through what we call unintended contribution to a readily avoidable harm. And here's another let's see. Let me skip that bit here. Why should we be held responsible for an unintended contribution, or for which such contributions might we reasonably be held responsible? This is where the category of a harm being readily avoidable comes in. The investor's relation to a war is not just that of an unintended contribution, since I might contribute to many different agents unintentionally, in a way that's out of my power or knowledge to effect. Rather, the category we need is that of a readily avoidable, and I keep using this phrase too, readily avoidable unintended contribution. The category of unintended contribution does moral work only if we can mark off indirect support for a separate agent. Let's see, the unintended contribution must be readily avoidable for it to be a legitimate matter of responsibility. We claim that one is responsible for one's unintended contributions to ill dealings when and only when there's public knowledge of those ill dealings. We also claim that one is not responsible for one's unintended contributions when the ill dealings are secret or hidden. We're not responsible only for what we intend. Among other things, we're responsible for preventing bad states of affairs in the world when it's easily in our power to do so. One easy way to lessen the likelihood of a bad state of affairs is to refuse to contribute to it, and we can easily do so when we know about it and need only omit selecting a particular investment option, for example. Let's look at these examples here and discuss the responsibility we might bear for actions taken by a Palestinian charity that has received our modest donation. Given that we're located far from the blast site in Tel Aviv, and that neither of us has any experience with explosives beyond fireworks as kids, of course, we're too far from the murder of 25 Israeli civilians to be suspects in the initial criminal investigation. If we can leave aside for the moment the question of the legitimacy of terrorist attacks in such circumstances, how much responsibility might we bear for those deaths seems to depend heavily on how invested we are, as it were, in the attack, or how closely aligned the attack with the attacker intentions in offering our donation might have been. Let's fill this out a little bit here. This first example here, innocent contribution. In this variation on the circumstances, we don't think it would be reasonable to ascribe any degree of responsibility to us, the donors who made the crime possible. The fact that we not only didn't know but couldn't possibly have known about the plans for a bomb put us in the clear. The horror that followed is no part of our intentions in making our donation. At the other extreme, though, lies another variation on this case, and we think clear responsibility for the deaths. So, B, 1B, willing participation. This case seems very extreme for most of us in more or less pacifist-leaning circles, as our commitments to peace preclude this sort of endorsement of violence. But if this were in fact the case, as it is for some people who are outraged by Israel's human rights record in Palestine, for example, we would bear a clear responsibility for the deaths that result from our actions. Our intentions and our actions place us clearly in the midst of what, for lack of a better term, we can call conspiracy. Not only did we know that something of this sort would happen, but our knowledge, our concurrence, our attempts to recruit others, and our wholehearted endorsement of the crime as it occurred makes us part of the plot. Perhaps the Mossad can't reach us, but the FBI could arrive on our doorsteps at any moment. We're not only responsible, but probably also legally liable. Several counts of various sorts of conspiracy are possible, as well as those 25 counts of murder. Since this is pretty extreme and unlikely to address most of the folks we're talking to, let's go step back a step here and think of another variation. It gives us a little bit less involvement here, this 1C, knowing contribution. This case is slightly more believable, if it's still far-fetched. How much responsibility do we bear in this sort of a case? Our intentions here attenuate the degree to which we're involved. Our role might be analogous to the merchant who sells the bomb-making supplies, knowing what's likely to happen with those supplies. Perhaps we have aided and abetted the criminals, perhaps we're accessories to the suicide bomber's crime. Even though we have not solicited funds from others on behalf of the charity, we still bear some responsibility, and the FBI might come knocking. Let's step back yet one more step here and look at 1D, negligent contribution. This version of the case begins to sound plausible to us. We think there are probably many well-meaning people who make this kind of contributions. How much responsibility can we reasonably be thought to bear, though, for taking claims of support for the martyrs as mere rhetoric and making our contribution without further consideration? If information about this charity, its reputation as a hotbed of terror, its connections to recent suicide bombings, that sort of thing, if they're well documented in the press, we think our donation was made either stupidly or negligently. We should have taken the few minutes it would require to check up on the organization we're thinking of supporting with our money. Stupidity isn't criminal, but negligence can't be. And in this case, given the nature of the crime we've enabled, we might expect some kind of criminal charges. Fearful of overanalyzing the possibilities, let's take a look here at 1E. This is probably the most likely case right now. It doesn't take too much effort. We have no knowledge. It's not secret per se. We find out later what was going on. It doesn't take much effort here for us to emotionally connect our donation to the bombing after the fact. But we shouldn't be held responsible because we couldn't reasonably have been expected to know about this link. Knowing us, me and Jeremy, that is, we're likely to be devastated. The very thought of having our peaceful intentions subverted in this way is very distressing. And even the tenuous connection to that much death is psychologically problematic for both of us. We've had the bad moral luck to have played a part in the causal chain, which led to tremendous harm and loss. Had it been our direct intention or our negligence which led to this harm, we would have faced some severe penalties, probably. Bernard Williams has called the emotion we ought to feel in this circumstance agent regret. As unwitting agents of harm, our feelings of agent regret reinforce the value of human life by highlighting the resemblance between our non-culpable involvement and killers. So, to summarize these 5 cases here, donors who are misled as to how their donations will be used are not responsible, but might reasonably feel agent regret. Donors who refuse to check up on the organizations they're supporting are negligent and are responsible, or stupid, and are responsible both morally and legally. Donors who know of and even applaud the plans of the martyrs supported by such a charity, quotation marks here, are accessories to the crimes committed with their support and bear a greater burden of responsibility because of their knowing contributions. And donors whose support for such plot passes into indirect assistance may well qualify as co-conspirators, and they may bear a heavy burden of responsibility for the harms that transpire because of their knowing participation. This isn't meant as a full typology of wrongdoing by any means. We intend only to show a few broad categories of complicity that might apply to someone and provides the means by which harms are done, how we might unintentionally contribute to avoid harm. So, how can we extend the preceding analysis into the realm of investments? Well, here they are. Donations to Palestinian charities may be relatively rare in the United States outside certain Palestinian exile communities or sympathetic Islamic congregations. We feel fairly confident that most of our readers have investments of one sort or another. Yeah, probably most of the folks in the room here have some kind of investments, whether they know it or not. In fact, nearly all academic philosophers in America contribute with every paycheck to retirement savings accounts held at TFRAF, probably. Those of us outside academia most assuredly have 401k or IRA accounts of one sort or another. What sort of responsibilities do we bear with respect to the investments we own? Let's consider this second set of examples, which we've drawn out here parallel to the Palestinian charity examples. What responsibility do we bear when we invest in the bonds of an American military contractor, let's call them the XYZ Corporation, which builds the smart bombs that kills those 25 civilians? Again, given that we're not in the military and that neither of us works for the bomb-making corporation, we're at enough distance that it seems a stretch to assign us very much blame in these 25 deaths. Let's assume for the moment that we're ardent pacifists who believe that war is never justifiable. Whether we're right or wrong about this is surely not within the scope of this essay, but it says something important about the philosophical moral commitments the two of us have made. How much responsibility we may bear in these cases depends again very much on how closely aligned our investments and our values might be. Let's add some details here. Then 1A, innocent contribution, or 2A, innocent contribution. This case seems laughably false on some levels, considering the complex tangle of red tape that surrounds every government contract. Surely there are public records of this company's involvement in the manufacture of these smart bombs. However, if it were somehow possible, we believe that we couldn't reasonably be held responsible for these 25 deaths. I mean, if it's a secret to such an extent that nobody knows about it, then we couldn't possibly. And the fact that no one outside the corporation knows about the connection between the bonds and the bombs puts us into the clear. Let's again go to the other extreme, the willing participation here. And instead of a clandestine military contractor, let's assume we have a proud military contractor, and that rather than ardent pacifists, we're a pair of war hawks. It's difficult to imagine that we'd ever find ourselves in this sort of situation given who we actually are. But if the facts were to fit this case, and we were not only intentionally participating, albeit at a financial remove in the production of these bombs, but also encouraging other people to do the same, we think that we'd have to bear some responsibility for the deaths that result. Had we decided not to purchase these particular bonds, surely someone else would have, and the bomb in question would still have been built and detonated. But our connection to those deaths would have been that much more tenuous. In this case, we're co-conspirators with the bomb-making corporation, and while making arms is not illegal, if there's any moral responsibility to be apportioned for the participants in the project, we should get a share. Let's look at the next case here. 2C, knowing contribution. It seems to us that we have two intentions in this case. First, to maximize the return on our investments, and second, to support our troops. Even if our main intention in a case like this is to earn a substantial return on our investments, our knowledge that these bonds will make bombs implicates us to some extent in the ensuing deaths. We did not set out to help build a bomb factory. And if we recommend these bonds to others, it might be just because of the financial gains to be made. But the manufacture of military weapons is not illegal, but our knowledge of the company's plans for the capital they raise certainly connects us to the deaths of the innocents. It makes us complicit in the deaths of those 25. This might not bother us, but it probably should. Now let's back up a step here. We're ardent pacifists again, but just not particularly careful about the impacts of our financial actions. So 2D, negligent investment. Our cynicism about a company's claims to be close to a Defense Department contract is understandable. After all, such forward-looking statements are heavily footnoted and disclaimed. There are always big, long paragraphs at the end of these kind of documents that say, these are forward-looking statements and shouldn't be taken as predictive of what's actually going to happen. We're just guessing it might turn out this way. Wouldn't it be nice? But, so there's some reason, it would be reasonable to say, well, these guys are just bragging. This is not actually going to happen. It's not uncommon for a company to make these kind of claims in an attempt to make their offering that much more interesting to potential investors. But the details of a company's past dealings, the purpose for which these dollars are being sought, ought also to be available in the basic information about the company, available to anyone willing to take the few minutes and look. An investment made in the bonds of this company without even seeking that information, we think, is made negligently, and we bear significant responsibility for the harms we've enabled. This case is representative, we think, of the way that many people with basically pacifist principles make their investments, without thinking too carefully about the potential impact of our investments beyond the purely financial returns, and perhaps without even reading any publicly available materials, We make our investments in whatever we think might give us the best short-term returns. Let's look at one more. It doesn't occur to altogether too many of us even to think in terms of the moral impact that our money might be having, our investments in particular. Let's look at this last example here, regrettable contribution to E. In this case, though the conglomerate's military contracts are more or less public knowledge, they're hidden from view well enough that we surely can't be held responsible for missing that information. Since we bought the bonds and financed the construction of the bond-making facility, we cannot avoid the same kind of emotional connection to the harms done through our investment as we have in previous cases. We think that in this case, as in the parallel contribution case earlier, agent regret would be an appropriate response. We're unwitting agents of harm, and while we do not bear any direct responsibility for those harms, we should respond in a way that shows our respect for the human lives lost. So, to summarize here, investors who cannot reasonably be expected to discover the end use of their investment dollars are not responsible for the harms done as a result, but should probably feel agent regret. Investors who decline to do any research about the companies in which they're investing are negligent and are therefore morally responsible. Investors who know of and even applaud the end use of investment dollars are complicit in the deaths of innocents, bearing that responsibility because of their knowledge. And investors whose enthusiasm for such investments passes into direct assistance to the company trying to raise capital bear a heavy burden of responsibility for those deaths because of their knowing participation. In this bit here, we've talked about corporate bonds, which are particularly interesting in that they're often tied directly to specific projects. Many corporate bonds can be thought of as being similar to consumer loans, for cars. money borrowed for specific purposes and backed by the collateral of the machinery purchased or the facilities built with the money borrowed. Treasury bonds, though, are generally issued just as unsecured debt, no collateral. You don't get a certificate that you own a little piece of the United States. They're backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government and its powers of taxation, so they're very safe bonds in that respect. Investors who purchase securities issued by the U.S. Treasury clearly help to support the operations of the Department of Defense. None of us can reasonably claim we think that we didn't know that our investments in those securities and our taxes, of course, pay for the military's war-making abilities. If we buy those securities anyway, with that knowledge and with our presumed pacifist bias, then we're either negligent or complicit, depending on our motivation. So, to leave bonds here for a moment, conversation about bonds is usually not very exciting. Our logo, the first affirmative logo is this little green and blue circle, and there's a line that goes up like this and then down and then up. And people have talked about it, have called that the bond index. It says you're having a nice conversation with somebody, it's going along real well, and then somebody starts talking about bonds, interest flags, and then they leave the topic of bonds and interest rises again. So talking about bonds is seldom interesting. We think that the way that a bond investor contributes to a harm done is fairly clear. A bond is a loan, and if the money I loan is used to cause some harm, then I bear some responsibility for my contribution. We haven't yet, however, spoken about stocks. There are essentially two sorts of stock owners: the original owners of a company, the first managers and venture capitalists who risk significant money to create the company in the first place, and the subsequent owners who buy their shares from the original owners or from other subsequent owners after the company is established. Think in these terms: investors in an IPO, initial public offering, give their investment dollars to the company, buy the shares from the company to help it expand its capital base. Investors in the secondary market, where most of us do what trading we might do, give their dollars to some other owner of that company's shares. So if I go out and buy shares of IBM, I'm not giving money to IBM, I'm giving money to somebody else who owns those shares. IBM never sees a dime. Let's see. Investors in the secondary market give their dollars to some other owner of the company's shares and make no direct contribution to that company's financial well-being. Those investors who buy IPOs or who have enough assets to devote considerable money to venture capital investment are in that sense similar to bond investors. Their investments go directly into the company's efforts to grow, and thus their dollars contribute more or less directly to the benefits and harms done by the company. In this respect, an analysis of their responsibility for harms done through their investment dollars would be parallel to the bond investors we just got through talking about. Since most investors trade common stocks exclusively on the secondary market or through mutual funds, almost all of which are limited to the secondary markets by charter and by law, we need to look at what responsibility attaches to that sort of ownership. And this gets a little weird because Jeremy made some limitations early in the paper that I didn't understand quite as well as I thought I did. So I'm not entirely on firm footing with this section, even though I wrote it. What does a share owner really own? Two things, really. First, a piece of a valuable entity, the corporation itself, and second, the right to a proportional share of any corporate profits in the form of dividends. So you own a share of Microsoft on November 16th. November 17th, they pay, what, $3 a share or something like that? Absolutely insane, huge dividends, one-time deal. That's the two, you own this piece of Microsoft and you own a share of, proportional share of whatever dividends they give out. Some investors focus only on the first of these, the actual valuable share itself, and watch share prices rise and fall, hoping to own more rising stocks than falling stocks. Some investment professionals would prefer to call these folks speculators, even gamblers, as they don't really care that much about the company itself, just the price of its stock, and they intend to make their profits by buying and selling shares alone. Day traders, we remember day traders from the late 90s, prime examples of this sort of investor. They don't really care what the company is as long as it's performing the way they think it ought to. Right? Other investors focus more on the dividends and hope to own the shares of strong companies with prospects for profits. Some investment professionals call these real investors, since they're buying pieces of a company with the intent to benefit from that ownership, not to gamble on price movements. Warren Buffett, Benjamin Graham, most other investing legends actually fall in this category. in this section, we'll focus on the real investors, those who intend to benefit from ownership rather than trading. The ethics of gambling is a whole nother matter, and I'm not going to get into that here. Let's say that we received a block of 1,000 shares of the XYZ Corporation, a gift or an inheritance or something. Balance sheet looks good, the share price is lower than it should be on a variety of measures, and such an investment fits quite well with our asset allocation target, right? We got a space for it right there. From a financial point of view, to be a great investment to keep. But if we are the ardent pacifists we claim to be earlier, and the XYZ company builds smart bombs, should we keep those shares? What sort of unintended contribution to harm would our investment make? Since we're talking about the shares of an established company traded on the secondary market, we're not considering making a direct contribution to the corporation's financial goals. We're not buying its bonds. We're not buying original shares, so our investment dollars are not ending up in the corporation. On the contrary, it's the corporation's dollars that are ending up in our pockets when we declare dividends. We could argue that there's something inherently wrong about profiting at the expense of others in the same way that we might be responsible for the harms of racism, say, even if we didn't perform any overtly racist acts, but only benefited from it. But it might be hard to see how that would qualify as a sort of unintended contribution of the sort that this argument needs. We think that there are two fundamental respects in which our ownership of the stock of a corporation constitutes an indirect kind of contribution. First, it makes a symbolic contribution in the sense that our willingness to participate in the profits of XYZ Corporation implies some sort of approval of the business activities that create those profits. Even if we don't intend to show this sort of support for the mission of the XYZ Corporation, perhaps especially if we don't intend it, our investment could have that meaning for others, and thus contribute to a general belief that investment in XYZ is morally not problematic. After all, it might be reasoned if philosophers and peace activists like Jeremy and Johann are willing to invest in XYZ, there must not be anything particularly problematic about it. Now, it's kind of out there. I mean, who's going to actually look at my portfolio and see what's in there? But, it could happen. Second, our ownership could be part of a kind of collective contribution in the sense of being one strand in a cable of support, which enables the corporation to continue to exist. If a significant mass of investors, and institutional investors like mutual funds or corporate retirement funds, for example, if a whole bunch of people were to try and sell all their shares of XYZ at once, or refuse suddenly to purchase the shares that some other investor put out for sale, the share price might crater, which could force the corporation into bankruptcy. Might also, incidentally, force the corporation into some kind of dialogue with those investors who were selling or refusing to buy in order to say, hey, what's going on? What can we do to make ourselves better? And in fact, that kind of dialogue with corporate management is probably the strongest tool that socially responsible investors have. Just saying, we're not buying your shares because you're naughty. That doesn't do a lot, because there's a lot of other folks out there who are willing to buy shares of corporations. The best example of that is tobacco companies. There are lots and lots and lots of investment managers who refuse to buy tobacco companies on principled grounds. But the companies are still out there. Their share prices are lower than they might ought to be, given the amount of dividends they pay out and that kind of stuff. So they fit really nicely into the value category for investors. They like the low share prices and the high dividend yield. So those investors who don't have that particular bias against tobacco companies are more than happy to buy those shares at the marked down prices. The demand lowers, so the price increases. Everybody's happy, sort of. Our deciding not to purchase or to sell shares of XYZ wouldn't probably set off a rush and destroy the corporation, me and my 1,000 shares. But our ownership of because our ownership of XYZ stock is practically inconsequential to the corporation in a financial sense, though it's very important to us both financially and morally. If our investment decisions have any sort of importance to or influence on others, then perhaps our leadership in a divestment effort could actually make a difference to the corporation as a whole. It's possible. Not likely, but it's possible. So far, we've talked about the wrongs of being a negligent investor and touched on the moral general category of dissociating oneself from ill dealings, selling of shares. We have one more point to make, which is a general point about economic citizenship. It feels weird to say we. Our argument, we believe, has fairly broad consequence for this domain of economic citizenship. This notion has begun to appear in human rights and global civil society circles, and as we defined it at the outset, it means being a citizen by way of one's economic deeds. Voting with our dollars is an expression that points to economic citizenship, and Gandhi's boycotts are classic examples. We might also say that to the degree that someone upholds her country's tariff policies, tax policies, being a part of the whole corporate intention to open the doors to certain goods and close the doors to others, she expresses economic citizenship. So supporting or not supporting your tax policies is another form of economic citizenship. What's perhaps surprising is how little people seem to think of their citizenship in these terms, especially in an individualistic society. We do not tend to conceptualize life in terms of corporate agency, and when we speak of life in the private sector, we tend not to think of public citizenship. We think this paper's argument shows a general point about economic citizenship by way of this particular case. As a morally responsible being, one should refrain from contributing to harms one could readily avoid. And both these harms and how one can avoid them are common matters of economic citizenship. This means that moral responsibility takes us to economic citizenship simply from our responsibility to avoid negligent action. As the world becomes more integrated globally, how we act economically will become more and more significant to the lives of distant others, to name just one kind of group our economy affects. Environmental ethicists warn us in this vein about our consumption patterns, especially in the industrialized north. Considerations of investment sound a similar warning. In our complicated and interdependent world, we have a responsibility, just as a matter of being moral, to be economic citizens of the world. At the beginning of this essay, we talked about, or mentioned, I should say, Anthony Appio's arguments about investment in apartheid-era South Africa, bringing kind of taint to anyone who refuses to divest. Our argument here doesn't hinge on the analogy between war and apartheid, but we do see a certain similarity. If we're certain that most, if not all, wars are unjustified and so fundamentally unjust, in much the same way that we're certain that apartheid policies are fundamentally unjust, we should want to avoid investing in the stocks or bonds of corporations that enable or profit directly from war. Our argument doesn't rely on the metaphor of moral taint, though we recognize the power of the metaphor to motivate investors. There are many people who refuse to invest in any sin stocks, usually weapons, tobacco, alcohol, gambling, pornography. Those are the biggies, though there's some variation from individual to individual. Many people refuse to invest in sin stocks because they want to maintain some sense of moral purity. In this essay, we've argued instead that we can come to much the same conclusion from an analysis of the sort of responsibility we bear for contributing financially to the corporations which enable and the governments which engage in war making. Our holding an investment in the stock of XYZ Corporation ties us to the harms done by the corporation and its products, and these links to the harms done constitute a kind of indirect contribution to the overall efforts of the corporation. An investment in U.S. Treasury bonds ties us that much more closely to the horrors of war, as the Treasury allocates a huge portion of the dollars invested to the Department of Defense. This is problematic for us, since our principles tell us that the whole reason for being, raison d'etre of the XYZ Corporation to provide the Department of Defense with key materials it needs to fight wars is itself immoral. Since prudent investment portfolios can be constructed without relying on these securities, we think those who embrace generally non-violent principles should do so, avoid those security burdens. As citizens with a responsibility for our economic agency, we need to be conscious of how our economic actions affect others, affect future generations, affect public goods, and so on. We have an obligation to what we want to call economic awareness. It's vitally important for us to understand what it is that we do and are as economic agents and the basics of how our economic activity functions. We might defer specific tasks to specialists such as financial advisors, but we need to know what we are doing when we act economically. We can't avoid responsibility by claiming ignorance. That's it. I figured on that taking less than an hour.
I'm having a little cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
Because I agree with the conclusions, and I'm having trouble with an important argument leading to it, which
Okay.
is the emphasis on responsibility for unintended consequences, or unintended harm, which there's kind of a reverse corollary that I don't like about it. not that you have offered the reverse corollary, but the reverse corollary troubles me, which is the fundamental tenets of the just war theory are distinction between combatant and non-combatant. Combatants, legitimate targets of war, non-combatants, non-legitimate targets of war. Why? Because one is engaged in the activity of combat, the other not. If you break down the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, which responsibility for unintended consequences does, then you open the door to a greater sphere of legitimate targets in war, opening the door possibility to total war arguments, for example. And even though I agree with the conclusion that we have an obligation not to contribute to war efforts if we're opposed to war, if 51% of the public is engaged in some kind of profiting by war investing, then 51% of the public becomes a legitimate target in war by the breaking of the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, by the breaking of the distinction of intention versus unintended harm.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. I don't think that attributing some responsibility to for my unintended contributions or my unintended consequences draws me into the fray, as it were. I do think that it's important to make a distinction between that suicide bomber who goes in there intending to destroy life and the bombardier who misses the target. You know, we know that in war there will be collateral damage. Right. But we want to make a distinction still between legitimate targets and illegitimate targets. And we say accidents happen. You know, which is not to say that collateral damage is fine. And it's certainly not to say that we shouldn't bear responsibility for those accidental deaths. It's just, I do want to say that we have responsibility for those accidental deaths, because they're unintended but eminently foreseeable.
How about this though? If a soldier is a legitimate target in the field, and a munitions plant is a legitimate target in the home front,
Sure.
in war, then the worker who goes to work at the munitions plant is a legitimate target if they're contributing to war effort, if they are unintendedly creating something that produces destruction elsewhere in war, which is the total war argument, that as we have an industrial society that has complex weapons, we are all to blame in some sense for the harm that's done. And hence, you know, the reverse side of that is, you know, de-invest, you know, divest, but that is also buying into the distinction, a collapsing the distinction between combatant and non-combatant. I'm wanting to say, I don't think the munitions plant worker is a legitimate target.
Oh, I agree with you, but I don't think that I don't think that the arguments we've made necessitate the collapsing of that distinction.
But it's based on a concept of intention.
Couldn't there be degrees? I mean, couldn't the worker at the munitions plant just be the legitimate target of some lesser form of punishment by the enemy? I mean, assuming that war making got to the point where there were gradations of punishment, right? So you could bomb the munitions factory, but just give the worker a really bad case of the flu. Just imagine.
That's a smart way.
No, just imagine, because when they employ weapons on the battlefield, they employ different. You sent pictures around of people who were hit by weapons used at at protests, which were treated as riots. But the weapons used at those riots were specifically designed, didn't meet the goal, but they were specifically designed to be non-lethal.
Right.
That means that there was an attempt on the part of weapons manufacturers to try to take it down a notch. So imagine that you could take it down a notch in terms of this collapsing of the distinction, right? So that would mean that the person who works the munitions factory still deserves some kind of slap in the face, right? Some kind of punishment, or they're legitimate for some kind of action. They're just not deserving of annihilation.
See, I'm not sure I want to go in that direction. I'm more than been willing to hold out the ethics of war as a separate matter. Particularly since, you know, one of the premises I started with is that no wars are justified. That, you know, if we have that kind of a presumption, then we don't have this problem. Because, no, if wars are not justified, then killing people in a war is not justified, so killing me for being an investor in the company is not justified either. So there's no collapsing problem there.
Because actually,
If-
there isn't a distinction between combatant and non-combatant, because all combatants would be unjustly engaged in action.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even if we were to say that there is some sense to the just war theory, and being who I, you know, knowing who I am, I do have a tendency toward just war theories. I don't see the necessity. I can see a temptation to break down that combatant non-combatant distinction along the lines of contribution to the war effort. But I don't think we need to go. I mean, I know that we don't need to go there, and I don't think that I can see doing it, but I don't think it works.
And the pacifist perspective does preclude, I mean, it just, yeah.
Cuts the
you're-
problem off.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
just non-issue.
Yeah.
So.
One thing I was troubled by was the focus on corporations that actually produce weapons, because I mean, especially with the current situation in Iraq, where you have so many different corporations doing various things there as part of the war effort. I mean, how? Okay, supposing that we can. Supposing that we go along with this ethical assessment of weapons makers, how would we treat corporations like Halliburton or others which are reconstructing Iraq now that we destroyed it militarily? Would you, if you, as an economic citizen, want to at least not support a war effort, if not pressure, put political pressure against a war effort, are you thereby also precluded from having investments in corporations that are part of the reconstruction?
Halliburton itself has its own special problems, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
But they're large, so they do both.
They are huge. They do all kinds of things, and they tend not to think too closely about the ethical implications of them. They have some special ethical challenges, Halliburton does. But it's a general problem in this field. Say, for example, we want to avoid shares of Boeing because Boeing makes fighter jets. Now, Boeing doesn't make all the pieces that it puts together. It buys pieces from other companies. For most of and a lot of those other companies had no idea what they're making. They just know they're making a widget that's shaped like this, made out of this material. It has to have these kind of tolerances. They have no idea what it's being used for. Can we invest in those companies? Because they're making a contribution, a key piece to this airplane, this warplane, can't be made without that company's contribution. So can we invest in that company too? Or do we have to cross them off the list as well? How about, the human resources companies that serve that small company's employees? All they do is provide support for the people who make this part, which gets built into this airplane by Boeing. Where do we draw that line? It's an insanely complicated practical problem, and I'm not sure that there's a good principled place to draw that line. So my answer is, I don't know.
It doesn't seem like you need to draw it though, because all you have to do is go after the most directly responsible companies, and you need a small portion of the most responsible to have an enormous ripple effect.
Right. I mean, if we were to convince Boeing to stop making fighter jets, things are insanely profitable for Boeing, so there's no way they could give that up. but say we were able to convince Boeing to stop making fighter jets. Surely, the expertise that these other companies have developed in creating these high tolerance parts would be useful for other purposes that Boeing might have, other commercial airplanes, or I mean, Boeing does a lot with rockets too, with space exploration kinds of stuff, satellites and rocketry. So maybe some of that stuff that's now being used for military purposes could be used for exploring Mars. I don't know. So there may not be a need to go to that level and say, hey, your business is connected to this business, or just connected to this war aim, therefore we're going to exclude you. It may not be necessary, but that's a huge issue in social investment circles, and bless you. And there's no good way to answer the question where you draw that line. Some people are willing to say that these big conglomerates, as long as they do less than 5% of their business in military contracts, then that's okay. Because if we were to, I saw a list not too long ago of the top military contractors, and FedEx. FedEx ships stuff all around the country, all around the world, for the U.S. military, for the Department of Defense. Huge contracts. But we don't tend to exclude FedEx from our portfolios because it's a relatively small portion, proportionally, of the business that they do.
Well, and it also raises the other problem is that we all use FedEx.
Sure.
We use FedEx because we think of them not as, royalty
Military
investors.
contractors.
We're just using them. Of course, when we use them, we contribute to their profits, which also enable them to expand in ways that we might not like. And the conglomerates, where Halliburton has Kellogg, Brown and Root, and what is it? Level 3 Communications has MDMR, or whatever it is.
Subsidiary.
Yeah, a subsidiary, which is a military operating unit. It's a private military firm. And although you might like some things Level 3 Communications offers, you never think about these other things.
Right.
I mean, that is unintended, but the profits will certainly be contributing to that.
Sure. And that's exactly the problem. How much evil can we do? Can we stomach doing? The other thing, another example of this is a wonderful little company, alternative energy firm, Ionics, was recently bought by GE. Just this last week, I guess, they announced. A lot of our clients own shares of Ionics. A great little company, does all kinds of good stuff, but GE bought it. So now what do? Do we sell those shares to GE? Do we try and sell them to somebody else who will then sell them to GE? Do we accept, the transfer and get shares of GE in our portfolio? Very difficult to know what to do on some levels. On other levels, if we can convince GE to change 5% of their business, it's a huge impact in the world because GE is such a monstrous, huge company. Those little companies like Ionics are great, and they're terrific little companies, but they don't have a huge impact all by themselves because they're so small. So, where do we focus our energy? In order to get into the kind of dialogue with GE that we would need to get into in order to have an impact on their corporate structure, we have to own some shares. So we have to tie ourselves to that evil in order to try and make it better. Some of the clients that we have, some of our investors are really uncomfortable, really uncomfortable, even with that concept, because they have this vision that what they want to do is stay morally pure in their investments. And that's all but impossible. Enron was a large holding in some of our portfolios up until the bitter end, because it looked like such a good company, and because they were so good at hiding their fraud that once it came out, once it was public knowledge, it was too late. Merck has been in our portfolios too, and it has had some serious difficulties recently with the virus stuff.
It almost seems like for you to achieve this investment morality that we're all talking about, that instead of looking at the companies and what they do, but you need to look at the people, actually running the company.
Mhm.
Like, companies are not mechanical entities out there operating in a vacuum. They're
Right.
actually run by human beings, and it's the human beings that run these companies. It's the judgment of their morality that's going to bleed over into what the company does and is culpable for. So, I mean, obviously, I don't want you giving away trade secrets, but you guys
How do we
look at
handle that?
individuals instead of, when we talk about looking at the performance of a company and their balance sheet, blah, 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 and all these factual ingredients, do you ever look at the people at the head of the ship?
Yeah. Well, we have to, and for just the reason that you said, because they are vital to the operation of their corporation. Probably the easiest, the best examples of those, though, are with the mutual fund companies that we work with. A lot of investment advisory companies will use mutual funds for portfolios. They'll use, these huge mutual funds that nobody really knows who the managers are or who, how this company makes its investment decisions, except by reading what's on the prospectus. With the social investment industry being, unfortunately, relatively small, we know the managers. We know who they are. We know how they operate. We know what their processes are, and when we have questions, we can call them up and say, hey, Diane, we know that you're running this high yield bond fund. Why is it, what's been going on here that's causing this problem? What is it about your process that's causing this issue? That's really unusual. Now, when it comes to actual individual companies, and their individual stocks, generally speaking, we don't have that kind of contact. At these smaller, alternative energy kind of companies or something, we know those guys too, because they come to our conferences and stuff too. But as do the mutual fund managers. But with GE, we don't know the leadership of GE any better than the guys on TV do. To what extent can we base our decisions on the basis of what we know about those folks individually, personally? There's only so much we can do. And at a really big company, there's a lot that goes on that the highest level managers may not know anything about, though they are responsible for it. The funnel of responsibility leads upward, but not all the information goes upward.
If I can ask a utilitarian question, it seems like the whole argument pivots around the fact that, as you claim, someone who does want to invest with any degree of morality can do so and do so profitably.
Sure.
What's the comparison to someone? I guess what I'm asking is how profitable? Bring it to the question of money. We're talking about investment here. Can you have a portfolio that performs as well as one that's morally ambiguous?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. No, and that's the answer you expected me to. No, there was. This has been. We were having this conversation earlier. All along, people have this presumption that, well, if I'm going to be doing good, then I'm going to have to give something up. I'm not going to be able to take advantage of those opportunities for being bad. Yeah, well, and the sophisticated version of the argument says, well, any limitation you put on the universe of stocks from which to choose is going to inherently change the possibilities, and it's going to have a deleterious effect. But practically speaking, it hasn't. There's probably the biggest, most well-known, most widely followed, and longest-lasting socially responsible index is the Domini Social 400. Domini Social Index. The Domini 400 has been around for, I think, 12, 13 years, and it's had its ups and downs compared to the S&P 500, which is very similar. But over the time frame that it's been around, the Domini Social Index has outperformed the S&P on a cumulative basis. Not every quarter necessarily, but over time. Now, 12, 13 years is not all that long. Right? That only takes us back to what, 1991, 2, and it's been a remarkable time for the stock markets. But there's been 20 years worth of research about the impact of social screening on portfolios. And just this last year, there was a really good article by Orlitsky is the guy's name. He did a meta-analysis, an analysis of all the different analyses that he could bring together. It's absolutely wild, the statistical technology that he used to smooth the different techniques that different studies had used, and to bring all those numbers all together, crank them all together, and he found that 30 years, 20, 30 years worth of studies all added up to either parity, even performance, or maybe a slight, statistically insignificant, but a slight advantage to social media. So, yeah, it's totally possible.
You have to argue in your favor on this and say that if you're a socially conscious investor, you're not going to be having the problems that, say, Smith Barney ran into, being complicit to the Enron scandal. Although fraud took place, fraud is a tremendous drop in value. And although some people didn't know about Enron, Smith Barney did.
Right.
And they got hit with something like $300 million fine for that.
Well, and the same arguments go along with a bunch of these other things. Say you're avoiding tobacco. Well, one of the things you're avoiding by not owning a tobacco company is you're avoiding lawsuits that are coming, that are going to, odds are good, going to take those companies down. If you're not investing in environmentally unsound, unsustainable kinds of companies, heavy polluters, again, you're avoiding some cost down the road that's going to be levied on those companies to clean up the messes that they're making. So, on the short term, if you're doing all your thinking in short-term thinking, then some of those kinds of benefits are going to be invisible. But if you're thinking in longer time frames, then those kinds of costs, those kinds of advantages become huge.
This is just a quick follow-up for his question about profitability, and I have another short question. Is the success of socially responsible investing possibly because it has been such a small part of the market? So because you said that these conglomerates own many, many things, and so for example, some companies, they do such a small percentage of sinful investing that they can stay in the portfolio. If the more people are converted, the more investment managers are converted to more socially responsible investing, the less effective socially responsible investing will be, because they will have to exclude more and more. So in other words, you don't want people to be converted to SRI, because that will make SRA less effective.
It'll kill capitalism, which is a goose that's laying the golden egg that we're trying to benefit from,
Well,
which we need to kill anyway.
It would. I don't want to go there. It's not necessary to kill capitalism. It's just necessary to put a human face on it. I think, there's. I said something in here about how if enough people got together and boycotted, decided not to buy or to sell all their shares, then the price could plummet. It could, but it would take an absolutely overwhelming majority. It would have to be, I think, I couldn't find it, which is why I didn't put it in here, but I think that somebody did some research and figured out that it would take about 94% of the market deciding that this company is not worth buying for it to have an impact, for it to have a significant impact on the share price. Because that anything more than 6% of being willing to buy the shares, they're going to be able to. And if the rest of the 93%, if 7% are willing to buy it, 93% of us want to sell it, well, they're going to get a great deal, aren't they? And the company, and they will, be able to keep the company afloat. So it has to be an absolutely overwhelming majority of folks who decide. And if our culture changes that much, well, won't we all be glad, and won't those companies be out of business already anyway? So,
Yeah. that makes, here's the other flip side of that question. Isn't there something built into socially responsible investing that would make you as a professional group not aspire to be more socially responsible? For example, trans fats, right?
Okay.
Trans fats are being more and more evidence is piling up that trans fats are bad, but they are absolutely ubiquitous, and they are in many companies that are considered socially responsible. So, is your group working on becoming more socially responsible, or is that is your attempt to come to a more socially responsible position together in sort of ethics conferences really a kind of professional suicide?
Well, there's two answers to that. There's the indignant answer, and then there's the real answer.
But this is my job, shut up.
That's my job. No, I'd like to answer that in two ways.
Buy, sell.
I'm sorry?
Buy, sell.
Buy, sell. No, yeah, our understanding of what issues are significant changes, and it has to. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, global warming wasn't nearly as much of an issue. When the Pax World Balance Fund is probably the first outright, out and out socially responsible mutual fund, started in 1971. The reason they started was this group of Methodist ministers decided that they didn't want to be invested in the Vietnam War in any way, shape, or form. So they, hence Pax. So they wanted to invest in peace as much as possible, so they created this mutual fund for themselves for their own retirement funds, and then it got some interest, and so they opened the doors. Were they worried initially about global warming issues, about environmental concerns? No. Are they now? Yeah. Just this morning, or yesterday afternoon, this morning, we have an internet discussion group for all of our representatives. We have 125, 130 representatives around the country. We have this discussion group that involves all of them. And somebody wrote saying, hey, drug companies are really morally problematic because, look at all the bad things that happen because of drug companies. There's all animal testing and research labs. There's, kids being drugged to the gills with Ritalin. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And one of our older representatives wrote back and said, hey, if it weren't for drug companies, I wouldn't be alive. Yes, there's bad stuff going on. There's good stuff going on too. The key is to find the good, isolate it, not isolate it, but encourage it, help expand that, and minimize. One of the things that I was talking about moral perfectionism earlier, a lot of our folks really want to say, this is moral perfection, this is what we ought to be shooting for. All this other stuff that we do is extraneous. We don't need to worry about this. We just need to focus in on this moral perfection. And moral perfection is perfection is the death of the better, right? We can make improvements without focusing ourselves on perfect. And as long as we focus on the perfect, we're likely to miss our opportunity to make things better. Yeah.
If I can just follow up with that, it leads to a weird problem though, and this occurred to me when you were talking about ionics, that the perspective that the paper explores for the most part is that of abstaining from companies that do wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But if the goal of SRIs is actually to push companies toward doing better, then that doesn't necessarily argue for disinvestment. And ionics would be a good example of that.
Sure.
So it becomes more complicated then.
It is more complicated. The reason I focused in here on avoidance investing, negative screening, is just because that's predominantly, that's what most people understand. It's easy to understand how that would be an issue. We talk about four pillars, or I don't know. There's four sorts of ways to go about social investing. There's negative screening stuff out. Positive screening, getting companies like Ionics, supporting them, offering some kind of possibilities. Shareholder action, shareholder advocacy, So owning those evil companies and trying to get them to be better. And the fourth one is community investing, providing microcredit to small businesses, reinvestment in small communities. Negative, and actually that was something that my boss this morning was telling me about. He said that this focuses on negative screening too much, and that I need to at least put a footnote or something. So yeah, I understand.
It seems like the question comes down to an issue of staying clean or cleaning the world.
And how bad do they have to be before you won't sleep with them in order to have
Right.
You know what?
Yeah. Well, the one group of companies that we absolutely refuse to own for our clients is tobacco. That's the one absolute exclusion. Others will hold if we have some reasonable expectation of being able to do some good shareholder action. But tobacco companies, if they transfer in with the client's portfolio, we sell them as quick as we can. Some folks absolutely refuse to sell those things, and we ask them to hold them somewhere else. Set up an Ameritrade account or something. It's out of our doors. We don't want to see it. But that's just about the only stuff we'll absolutely refuse to.
Well, where does your mission statement fall as far as changing what the economic climate does in this property and or conversely just trying to stay out of that kind of I mean, how I guess what I'm asking is how active are you in trying to change the world as compared to just staying out of that?
Very difficult. Can you tell me how to measure that? No,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
do you
let's
treat
see.
each individual investor and say, okay, what's
Each
your
individual,
goal?
yes, definitely. Each individual investor has their own individual moral concerns, and that's where we focus our efforts. As an institution, we have more than, there's a sort of industry-wide goal to get 1% of an investor's investment dollars into community investing. We have about 1.5% institutional. Our sub-account managers, we don't, First Affirmative doesn't actually file any shareholder resolutions. We don't have the resources to do that. But some of the sub-account managers, the mutual fund managers, and the individual account managers that we have do a lot of that kind of stuff. And some of our representatives are particularly active in that kind of stuff. One of the guys out in Berkeley, go figure, was really involved a couple of years ago in a bunch of stuff at ExxonMobil, trying to get them to adopt an actual honest-to-goodness human rights policy, which they refused to do. But he was involved in some of the pressure that was put there to try and get them to do that.
Hey, Johann, we have a class coming in here at this point, so anyway, I was hoping everyone would join me in thanking our speaker. That's really great.